Welcome everybody to this month's Agility Learning Lab. Today we're going to be going over grid transactions. As I mentioned in the invite and description for this learning lab, this is a little bit of a level 2 session, building off of our session from this past June on agility grids. So this one's going to be really focused on the functionality that you can put into grids, all the different transactions, different buttons and types of buttons, and just ways to actually perform some kind of functionality from inside of a grid rather than just create an informative grid. So that's what we're going to be getting into today. I also mentioned in my invite, if you had a chance to watch June's Learning Lab, that'll help you, give you a little bit of a baseline for this. If you haven't, you may want to go back and watch it later after this session if there's some gaps, but while this builds on it, it's not necessary. It's not a requirement to watch that session first. There's plenty of good information today without seeing that session. So before we get into that, I always like to do a little introduction. So if you haven't been here for before for one of our learning labs, or if we haven't met at all, it's nice to have you here today. My name's Chase Linsenbigler. I like to leave my camera on for introductions, so it's nice to see everybody. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off though, so you can focus on the content. And what I do here at WiSys is I manage all of our partner enablement. So I work with the WiSys partner channel just to help them become stronger with the product and do everything in my power really to enable our educated partner base just to be the best they can with our product. I'm a former customer facing consultant, so I learned all the tools, all the ins and outs of our product and Design Studio specifically, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I learned all of that and decided to bring that over to the partnership side here so that I can bring those skills to our partners and enable them as much as possible with, the background of a WiSys consultant. Now, these learning labs will be on the second Tuesday of each month from 2:30 to 3:30 EST. I always like to mention this to everybody as well. The invite for the learning lab only goes out about a week in advance. It takes a lot of prep to come up with a full learning lab and decide on a topic and everything like that. So you only get about a week, lead up time to sign up for this and get this on your calendar. So if you want to make sure you're here, it will always be the second Tuesday of each month, 2:30 to 3:30 EST, same time. So if that's not enough notice for you when the email goes out about a week in advance, you could block that time off on your calendar too to make sure it's available. We'll adhere to that schedule and always do our best to keep it to that same date and time. For my partners that are on the call today, if I'm not doing anything with you guys currently, I always like to mention, I want to get standing appointments with as many partners as possible just to keep you enabled and help you the most that I can with the product. That can be anything from introduction training to design tool training. We can go through the basics of the product in an introduction training, and then we can get into the deep details of how to tailor applications with design tool training. A lot of my partners who have been through those sessions too like to have standing team meetings, and that allows us to do continued enablement, just talking about customer processes, customer tailorings, customer issues, or even your team's own questions and issues when it comes to WiSys and the Agility WMS. So if you're a partner on the call today and we don't have anything currently, reach out, set something up. I love to, just have some regular time to talk with all my partners as much as possible. And I think it really enables our channel to be as strong with the product as they can whenever we have that constant communication. All right, so without further ado, what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start out going back to that June session and just talk a little bit about the functionality we discussed in that session. If you watched it, you would have seen that there were two different types of button functionality, so to speak, that we did in that June session when we created a grid. So we'll go back over those. That was printing and SAP document linkage. I did those because they're just easier. There's no other way to put it. They're easier functionality to understand and get a grasp of. So for the first session on Design Studio and grid creation, I felt like, okay, let's give an introduction to transactions with some simple ones. But today we're going to talk about everything you need to know in regards to transactions. We'll cover all the ins and outs. After we review that functionality, we'll go over button types. We're going to talk about agility component buttons, plugin buttons, but really the main focus today is going to be transaction/report buttons. And inside of there's a lot of different actions you can perform, and there's a whole transaction flow that goes with those buttons. So the first time you go in there, if you haven't had training on it or seen it before, it can be a little bit confusing or a little bit tricky. So we're going to have that ability to go in, go through all of that information, and by the end of today's session, it's going to be a lot to digest. You're probably going to want to go back and watch it, and maybe even ask me some questions after the fact through email. But it is going to give you all the tools you need to jump in here and start building out grids that can perform some actual pretty interesting transactions and pretty advanced transactions. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in here. And I'm going to start the session off by going into Design Studio. And actually, I should minimize this first. So Design Studio is that DS application here on the desktop. I always like to show that. Across the top here, I have our 3 design tools. LS is for Label Studio. That's, of course, where you're going to create labels. FS is for Form Studio, where you'll create handheld applications. And Design Studio, of course, is for your desktop applications. So when you see DS there, you can think DS for desktop, and that's where you'll go in and create all of your grids and dashboards, graphs, calendars, all the different things you want to create for your agility system. All right, so we're working on Design Studio here. And the first thing, I'm going to go into my Learning Lab project because we're going to build off of the grid that we made in our June session. So again, if anybody was here for that, if you're following along step by step with me here, I'm going to actually go in and show some things in the grid that we created. But if not, that's not a big deal. Before I go into that project though, I want to say you always want to make sure when you're creating custom applications, tailored applications in WiSys, you want to make your own custom application project, and you want to make sure you make copies of anything that you're changing. So if I took a grid that exists out of the box and I just made changes to it and then updated WiSys, of course, that grid would get overridden because we're going to bring back the most current code. So we're going to bring back the most current version according to the out-of-the-box WiSys system. So you want to make sure if you're following along, making changes, if you're making your own tailored applications here based on this video, make copies and put them in your own tailored application project. And that's what I did here. I added a Learning Lab project, and that's where I'm going to be working out of. So we'll give that a second to open here. And here in my Learning Lab project, last time I made a copy of our standard palette view grid. That's an out-of-the-box grid that we have that basically shows you all of the palettes and packages in your WiSys system. So I made a copy of that. If we preview here, we had a filter on there. So I'm looking at packages 80 to 100. And we have a child grid on here so that I can click on a line and I can see this package, and then I can see the contents, the line information of the package down below. So that's the basic structure of this grid. Packages up top, line information for that package below. That's not super important for what we're going to do today, but I just wanted to give that little disclaimer because we're going to talk about the buttons that are on here, and they, of course, are set up for how this grid is set up. So first, the most simple button we have on here right now is a hyperlink on the item number in our child grid, and that hyperlink connects to the document in SAP. So when I click that hyperlink there, it can trigger a document to open from within of it, from inside of SAP. So here I have SAP Business One open. If I click this document while B1 is open, I have to be logged in and have access to Business One. It'll go ahead and open up the document. Now this could work for a PO, a sales order, a transfer request, or in this case, I'm doing it for an item. I could have a hyperlink here on the location to open up warehouse information, right? We can hyperlink to any document type inside of Business One, and that's what we did here. So if I click on this, opens up B1 and opens up the document there. Again, I have to have Business One open so that I have access to, the B1 client here. Also, this isn't going to work for any users that, maybe they're like limited logistics or something like that, and they don't go in here to the actual B1 client. But users that have access to the B1 client, we can put that hyperlink on and open documents. And we're going to talk more about how that's set up, but I just wanted to refresh you that we did that last time. And then up here, we have another button here, and it's our print button. And what that does is I simply can click on a palette and I can print a palette label to the screen, right? So I could click as many as I want and then hit print and print, various palette labels. I'm gonna check my printer definition here. All of my palettes are set up to print to screen. So I click this palette. If I hit my print button, I'm just gonna print my document to the screen. So in that case, it's an actual physical button that we created on the screen, and we just added the transaction functionality for a print. Again, we're going to talk a lot about that today. Just wanted to refresh on that and show you guys what we made last time as far as transactions. I'm not going to print these other ones here. All right, so that's how the grid currently is. We have two types of buttons on here. We have our hyperlink that links back to a document in SAP. We have a print button, but we're going to talk more about the details on how those are set up and what they do, as well as all the other options that are in there. So we covered two very simple options to begin with. Now we'll get into the nitty gritty, and we'll talk about all of the very advanced features that we have here in Design Studio. So I'm going to close out of my grid, jump back to Design Studio here, and I'm just going to double click to open the grid up. Just give that a second to load here. All right, so I'm going to jump over to my buttons. And first, let's talk about button locations, and I'll show you how all these look too. It's just good to be aware of this. So first we had our print button. That's at the link bar at the bottom of the grid. Now it's important to note, and we'll go back and look at this in a minute. What you saw was it was in the middle of the screen on the current setup of our grid. That's because there's a child grid attached, right? So we have another grid living inside of that current grid. So this print button appears in the middle of the screen because it's a button on the first grid, the grid on top of the screen. So if we didn't have that second grid attached, this would be just at the bottom of the screen. This is at the bottom of the screen of the grid that it is on. So if you have two grids connected, it'll be at the bottom of the top grid because it's not related to the bottom grid. So that's what a link bar is. We can add a button on our toolbar. That's at the top of the screen. We'll go ahead and add one here. Yeah, let's add a toolbar button, and we'll just keep it named button so you can see what that looks like. You see it right here. It's just at the top of our grid here. Well, I added an agility component button, and you actually have to have an agility component in there. So that's why we bugged out here, because I didn't attach anything to it. So let me just change that to transaction report. We'll go over agility component as well, but obviously you're going to error out if you have a button there that's supposed to have a component attached and you don't put anything on it. So that's my bad there. I skipped over a necessary step. But you'll see now I changed that to transaction. While I still haven't built out a transaction, that one's okay. If I haven't built it out yet, it's not going to error out on us. So there you see, if I check a line, we just have a button here, right? So if I added various ones to the toolbar, they'd be across the top. We can forget about our bottom grid there. And this is our standard top grid here. So we can ignore this piece. And here at the bottom of our grid that we're editing, we have our link bar as well. That's where that print button is. So toolbar here, link bar here. Now if I jump back in here, we also have a hyperlink. That is what I showed you before. The hyperlink would actually be on a field in the grid. So just to demonstrate that, on our child grid, we have that hyperlink that I showed you before where you can click on the item number and it will open the document. So if I go to buttons here and go to hyperlink, you'll see I have that item button and it's just on a field. So you pick a field, you say, okay, in this grid, I want to put this hyperlink on item number. So, in this case, you click on that item number, it opens up the document in SAP, right? But I could have made the link field there item description, and you could click on the description, it would open up the item in SAP, or I could have made it unit of measure and still made it so that if you click on the unit of measure, it opens up the item master in SAP. Doesn't necessarily matter, but essentially how a hyperlink works is it's on an actual field. So it'll be on that piece of data in that field. It'll turn blue. You click it and it hyperlinks you to whatever you create. Doesn't necessarily have to just open up business one and open up a document in business one. I could do all the same transactions that I do in other places using the hyperlink on those fields if I wanted. Does it really make that much sense? No. That's why you're only going to see out of the box hyperlinked fields opening documents in business one, but it would have the same access to the same functionality as any of the other button types available. All right, now I'm going to go back into my main grid and I'm going to show you the last one here, and that's our ribbon bar. Ribbon bar is important to talk about a little bit here too, because you have the ability to make, they're called pages and groups, but really it's kind of like tabs, right? It's like a tab structure to the top of the screen here. So I can make a page and I can add groups underneath the page. So the page here I could just call buttons. That's going to be the main tab, kind of like these here at the top of the screen. So when I'm in my grid, you'll see one called buttons. And then underneath of that, you see how it says elements here, I can add groups. So I could have a button group down there called print. We'll just call it print. And that would maybe have a button that prints a pallet label, another button that prints a packing slip, and maybe a third one that prints a BOL. And then here I could have another one called transactions, and maybe this one allows me to, maybe there's a button that does a pallet letdown, another button that does a pallet transfer, so on and so forth, right? So apply, okay. Oh, well, actually, before I get out of that, I should add a button to one of those. So I go to my ribbon bar here, we'll add a button to transaction here, and you can see what that would look like. I did it again. So make sure if you're using component type and you go back in here to check it, you're aware it's gonna error out. But here you'll see, you know, I'm using component type, that's why it's yelling at me, but I have a button up here. So there's my page, right? Page is a tab, so you have your regular tabs. If you can display, those always come with a grid, but then you can click on button here, and underneath my page, I have my groups, transaction, and print. So again, remember, if you have it set up as agility component, you need to have something in there or you're going to get error codes as soon as you open the grid. So for testing purposes, you don't want to just throw that on there and hit OK because it's going to yell at you. But now let's look at it with transaction on there. So here, button, check a line, and there's my button inside of the transaction group there. So page is buttons, that's a tab at the top of the screen. Can add as many groups as I want, and then it'll put the buttons inside of those groups. That is your ribbon bar there. All right, so now that's all the locations where you can put buttons, right? It's nothing too crazy, nothing too advanced, but it's good to know and good to be aware of where everything can go in there. But now let's actually talk about you know, all of the different transactions and types of buttons that you can have. So we'll go back in. I'm gonna just go ahead and delete my ribbon bar. Gotta do it step by step here. So I'm gonna get rid of this. And we're gonna play around with our toolbar button today. We'll just use that. So that's the button at the top of the screen, and that's what we're gonna add some functionality to here. So first, I'm gonna jump back to agility component now, the one that was yelling at us, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is. So inside of Design Studio, you have components. Components are any type of application that we create here inside of Design Studio. Anything you're making in Design Studio is a component, and we have the ability to just call a single component directly using a button. So first, before I even adjust this, let's talk about what all components are available. So here up in maintenance, you could add a new component. So components are, you know, a whole mess of different things, right? Typically, when we talk about components, you think of grids or process grids. The first grid here is a process grid because it has those check boxes allowing us to do bulk transactions. The second one is just a regular grid because there's no check boxes. It's just a little bit more information focused. It's kind of just for informative purposes, maybe a simple transaction, but you're not doing those bulk transactions. But then you have all these different other things like a graph or a calendar, things you've probably seen before. And if you haven't, I have lots of videos up on our WiSys YouTube channel if you want more information on those, or we can also set up a one-on-one session just to kind of go through the different components and talk about it. But these main ones up top here, are the different things you're typically going to see inside a design studio, like a grid or a calendar. But you do add crystal reports in here as components, or a nice label as a component. It's just housed in your Agility Design Studio then, so you can use it inside of our grids and things like that. You could have a specific SQL script that you create. Maybe you're using it for functionality in a grid. You can add it in here as a component, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different types of components in here, but that's what you're able to call with that component button type. So let's go ahead and jump back in here and actually set that up now. So here, I want to go back to my toolbar, and we're going to edit this button. And I'm going to go down to linked component properties. So I have my button type as Agility component. I want to go to my link component properties, and we're just going to go ahead and grab any component here in the system. And actually, let's do this. So I'm going to grab my package line grid here. That's the child grid that works out of here. So again, the regular functionality when we use this as a child grid, we highlight a line in the main grid in the package header level, right? So we say, okay, package 64, I'm going to click on that. And then down below it would show the lines. But what we could do, and what we're going to do right here is, I'm going to attach that to the button functionality. So our button type's a component button. It's on our toolbar. And when I click this component button, it's going to pull up that grid for package line data based on what I have selected in the main grid below. So I'm going to grab my package line grid as the component I want to use. Then I'm just going to define a linked column here. So I'm going to say, okay, I want to look at package ID because the target column, it's looking for package ID from that line information. So I'm going to grab package ID from my header grid, save that, it's defined, hit OK. Now we can see how that would function. So pretty simple here. There's not a lot of setup involved in those component buttons. And you see it's not yelling at me now because I actually defined a component. So I can click a line here, and then I'm just going to look at the line details for that. So here below, you can see like the child grid is displaying 2 line items in the package, or I could hit the button here and I'm going to get that same grid displayed on the screen. So basically that component button allows you to use a pop-up where once you click the button, you can call another component, right? So if I had a shipment calendar I wanted to open up, that when I click on that line, it opens up a calendar here, and it'll show me on the calendar where that shipment number, the shipment number that's attached to that pallet, it'll show when it's due to be shipped. I could do that. If I wanted to hit this button and have a graph pull up that shows how many orders I have every day for the next week, I could do that, right? Any component I create can be attached to a button here to open as a pop-up. So that's a pretty simple example, not a lot of setup involved, but you see, pretty easy there, right? I attach the component, click the button. You don't have to have a linked field. The linked field comes into play if you want to filter that grid essentially based on a piece of information, right? So here I'm pulling that package line information based on the package number above. But if I wanted a grid to pull up that shows me every shipment in the system, and I don't want to filter it to just show the shipment of a selected line, I could have a shipment grid here, but not link any columns. And that grid would then just pull all the shipment information. There would be no filter on it. So the link column essentially attaches a filter just like you would for a child grid or something like that. Now, the second button type is a plugin. I'm going to kind of just gloss over that one. We'll look at it, but this isn't something that a lot of you are going to use on a regular basis. So a plugin, applies more to our actual development team, and it requires actual development to create them. So that's essentially a user control that we're going to capture as a plugin, and then we're going to use it inside of Agility Explorer. We'll use that plugin to work kind of similar to how you just saw a component work as a pop-up inside of different applications here in Agility Explorer. So for the most part, this is going to be something that would actually have to be developed by our dev team and then put into a grid this way, right? It would be a user control our dev team would make, and it could be attached in here. But you do technically have the functionality to access any of the user controls we have out of the box and attach them to buttons on a grid. So I'll just show you what that would look like here. So now you see when I hit the magnifying glass there for component name, instead of all the types of components that came up before, you see all these external. That's because these are external plugins. And now I'm using a plugin button, so I only have access to plugins in it. Now, pretty simple here. I'm just going to grab this first one, package 4 pack and ship plugin. That's the plugin in Fulfillment Manager that allows me to pack and ship shipments, right? So let's say in here, for whatever reason, I want to put a button that opens up Fulfillment Manager because maybe my whole staff that uses Agility on the desktop works out of one grid all the time and they're in there all the time. So if they want to open up Fulfillment Manager, instead of clicking on it on the side of the screen in Agility Explorer like you normally would, I just want to be able to open it from a button. We could do that. So I can click the button here, and you'll see my Fulfillment Manager plugin will just open up on the screen. Then I could go about my business, right? I could go in here and grab a shipment and proceed as I normally would and ship this shipment if I want to, or do whatever I want with it. So that's an example of a plugin and how they work. So Fulfillment Manager uses a plugin, but again, that one's a little more technical and something that most of you are probably not going to do, and you're typically going to need our team's help to do something like that because it's going to require the development team to actually create a user control. But it's good to know for any of you that might be engaging with our consulting team or using our team services that that functionality is there. We can create a user control, capture as a plugin, and stick it inside of a grid or a calendar or, a graph, anything like that, right? All right. So those two types of buttons are very simple to set up, as you saw. You just click the button type and link up that component there. So those are very simple. But now what we're going to do is we're going to get into transaction/report. Transaction/report is the button type that you're going to be using, I'd say probably 90-95% of the time. That is the most utilized button type, and that's the one that allows us to actually do transactions on the desktop just as we would on the handheld. So basically, if you think about any handheld form that you have that you do scanning with, we can bring that to the desktop here. That functionality can come and be used from within grids, right? So if I want this grid to transfer pallets just like I would on the handheld, I can do that. If I want at the click of one button to pack all of my selected pallets onto a shipment and ship that entire shipment just in one step, right? I could check 20 boxes, press one button, and it would pack all 20 of those onto a shipment and ship that shipment. I could do that in here. Any functionality that WiSys provides on the handheld or on the desktop out of the box, you have access to here in Design Studio. So I can't stress enough how powerful of a tool this is. And this is all handled in the transaction/report button type. So that's where we're going to spend the rest of our session here today, is digging into that. And there's a lot to go over. So I'm going to try and keep it pretty brief on all the options. I'm not going to go in as much detail as I did on some of these opening things, but you'll get all the pieces you need here. So first, when I select transaction/report, I'm going to scroll down, and in transaction properties, I want to just go down to transaction definition here at the bottom and hit define. So kind of like with those last two buttons, when you would hit that lookup next to agility component and you would see a list of components, here you want to go down to that transaction definition and hit define. And that's where you can go in here and set up all of your transactions and see all the transactions available. Hold on one second. I'm just grabbing a sip of water. All right. So now inside of here, we have this whole transaction flow. So when you first go in here, if you're not familiar with the product, you're probably like, okay, I don't know what's going on. What are all these different tabs? That's what we're going to talk about first to get you set up in the right direction here. So on the home tab, that's basically behavior, right? That allows you to change some behavior for how your grid's going to function. That's not super important for what we're talking about today, so I'm just glossing over that. But that doesn't really factor into actual transactions. So now we'll move on to form variables. So here you can see I have a form variable I added. This is essentially a constant. If you're familiar with designing our handheld applications, you'd be a little bit familiar with that. A constant is a value that we define in here, and it's concrete, it doesn't change, and we can use that in transactions, right? So let's say for whatever reason, I know that I am always going to perform transactions in warehouse 05, and I don't want to take any chances with looking at the view to grab the warehouse of the package or anything like that. I know I always want to do them in warehouse 05. I could go here and add a variable, and I could just call this warehouse, and that's going to be an integer, and then I can just give it a value, and it's always going to be that value. So I could say 5. I want 05 actually. So 05 warehouse, it's an integer, right? And now it's hard coded, so I can use that in any of the other transactions I'm going to set up, and I have that constant value of 5 for warehouse there, doesn't change, right? And I have that consistency that I know, okay, that's hard coded. So if I want to hard code something, that's how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to set it up here as a form variable. So those are hard coded values. Then we have form fields, and we'll actually look at how this works. A form field allows me to input values whenever I click the button, right? So let's say I want the ability to create a new palette. That's what my functionality is going to be, right? So if I'm going to have the functionality to create a new palette, maybe I want to actually identify what the palette number is going to be. So I want to go in here, create a new palette, and actually tell it what the palette number is. So I can go in here and make an int field and call this palette no. Okay. And then my value source, I can put user entered and then save, apply, okay. And if I go back in here, once this loads up, hit okay on my filter. And now I'm going to make my new palette. Oh, hold on there, I didn't assign my button correctly. Let me go back in. Yep, I didn't save my form field. Okay, so maybe I want a form field in here. I'm just gonna call it palette number. I want it to be user entered. I don't want a space in there. That's what screwed everything up. I didn't even notice. So don't want that space. I want camel case, just like if I were in SQL actually doing something. And let's see if we can get that to get picked up. All right, now it's palette number. It's going to be correct. Apply, okay. So it essentially creates it. Oh, I clicked the wrong grid. It essentially creates it like those variables I was talking about, except this time the information is going to be saved instead of a constant that I, hard code in there and it's always the same. I'm going to actually identify what I want that value to be. I'm doing something that is finicky there. Let me just see. Yeah, it went back to what I had that I don't want. So let me make sure it saves it correctly here. So again, I screwed that up myself by putting a space in the naming. Nope. Don't want that. Here, I'm just going to remove this one because I messed it up, and I'm going to restart it and do it correctly. And I don't want it to be string. I want it to be integer. And we'll just call it PLT for palette, no space. We don't want to do a space. All right, there it is. That looks correct. And this should work this time. Sometimes it's a blessing in disguise when you get to see some of these things live, because you get some quick troubleshooting, right? So make sure you remember, act like you're in SQL when you're actually doing things in SQL. Don't just be putting spaces in there. That can break your variables, right? So that's what I was doing wrong, and you saw I was getting an error and I wasn't able to proceed. So now we have our palette field, that's our form field, and I can actually capture the palette number I want to use. So let's say I was going to create palette 42, I could type that in here and hit OK. And then in my actual transactions that we're going to look at here in a minute, in those transactions, now I would have access to the form fields that I capture as well. So just remember, with those two pieces, form variables are constant hard-coded information, right? I can go in there and say every time my warehouse is warehouse 05, and I want that hard-coded and I want to use that throughout all the other transactions. Or I have the ability to come in here and use a form field, and a form field can be captured at the time of clicking the button. And I can say, okay, I know that I'm creating new palettes and I want to identify the palette number that's going to be used. So I'm going to have a palette form field here. Maybe I also know that I am using a UDF in the WiSys package table, right? And I want that UDF to just have some information for maybe I have 3 different types of pallets, right? Maybe I have a plastic skid, a wooden skid, and then maybe another pallet that is made of carbon fiber or something, right? Just a random example. But if I have those 3 different types of pallets and I want to capture that in the UDF, maybe here I want to have a form field called pallet type, and I can enter in, okay, plastic, and the pallet type is plastic. I hit okay, and it saves that piece of information, right? So again, form fields and form variables are very important when you're actually building out transactions, because they allow you to capture information you're going to need that might not be displayed in your grid. So it's important to remember that. And that's something that will be used in the other transactions that we're going to show you now. But you just want to remember that these 2 fields allow you to capture information. This is hard-coded values. This would be capturing information manually at the time that you hit the button. Now with a startup query, you have the ability to add a data query here, and you can grab a data query that you've created inside Design Studio. So here you'll see all these different queries that I have living inside of my Design Studio. These are components. So same thing that we talked about before with plugins or the components like a grid or a graph or a calendar. These are saved inside Design Studio. This time we're just looking for the data query type of component, and we can add that to our startup. But basically this allows us to run a query at startup, right? So startup query, we click this button after we capture our variables, right? So form variables are automatically captured, they're hard coded. Form field, we would enter in the information we want to put in, hit OK, add that to those various fields, and then a startup query would run before any transactions would happen. So remember, this is a hierarchy. First thing is home. How does the button function? Just key options about how the button functions. Then capturing information with variables and fields. Then startup query. Then we would have our actual transactions that'll happen after the fact, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so we could run this startup query here, and that could be a variety of different things. Maybe we want our startup query to just be a validation. That's fine. We have things like that, right? We do validations all the time in WiSys. That's a very important part of the product. So we could do a package type validation where we want to say, okay, this button can only run if it's a pallet, right? So we want to run this validation as soon as they click the button and enter in information. We want to run this validation to make sure that the package type is pallet and not carton. We can add that to our startup query here, and that will run with the query to check and make sure, okay, is package type PLT? Yes. All right, I can proceed with the transaction. If it's not, then no, I'm going to error out and make them go back and pick an actual pallet and not a carton in the system, right? So that is pretty simple, right? A startup query, it's pretty self-explanatory. It is a data query that you have added as a component in Design Studio that runs as soon as you hit the button. And a lot of the time it might be something like a validation where you're checking to make sure a key piece of information is correct before allowing the user to process the transaction they're trying to do. And again, in our case, we're talking about, okay, we only want this button to function for pallets. So if we check the package type and it's a carton and not a pallet, we want to error out. That's why we're using the validation, right? All right. Now the important piece, the part everybody's wondering about, is our actual transactions that are going to function on the button. And those are added to the header, the detail, and the footer. So again, going back to the fact that this is a hierarchy, it is an order that you want to make sure you follow this correct structure for your grids to actually function correctly. So we start with capturing that information, run a startup query to make sure everything's correct before proceeding. But now our actions, if we're doing compounding transactions like we would on the handheld, we want to make sure they're stacked correctly. So our first piece of information with a header, I have a good example for us here to just kind of visualize this, right? Let's say we want to start by, well, let's say we have this button, and what we want to do with this button is we want to create a new shipment from scratch. Then we want to add packages to that shipment. So every line that we checked on our grid is going to be a different package we're going to add to the shipment. And then at the end, we want to print a BOL or even ship. We could have it just be a one-stop shop where they click it, it creates the shipment, adds the packages, and ships it out the door. We could even do that. Or we could just have it create the shipment, add the packages, and print out a BOL and a packing slip. And then we wait for the driver to pick it up before shipping it. Whatever the process is, that needs to follow a hierarchy because certain things need to happen at certain times for other things to function, right? So the first thing that would need to happen is the shipment would need to be created. The shipment has to be created before any packages can be added to it, of course. So that would need to be our header information, right? The shipment needs to be created first. So I could go to add transaction and I could grab create shipment create, and that could be my first transaction on here. Then on the detail, I would need to add packages to that shipment. So I think that's called package add. So we could do add multiple packages to the shipment. That's on our detail line, right? And then we can also have it automatically add a print. That's what you see here is it adds a pallet label print when you add them to the shipment. And then maybe the last piece, I just want to go grab a crystal report. I don't know how many I have in my system here really, but I could just grab a crystal report. Let's say that's a BOL. Oh, I don't even have that, but we could add a BOL here to the footer because that has to happen after the packages are added to the shipment, right? So you see the hierarchy there that you would need to add, your first level of information, the first thing that needs to happen, that would have to be on the header. Then you have your trickle down effect where, okay, on the detail, now we're adding packages to the shipment we created. So that's the second step. Then the last step, you can't print a BOL before you added the packages. So you don't want the BOL to be on the detail line because that's not going to give you a full BOL that shows every package on the shipment. So you want to add your BOL print to the footer. Or if you wanted to ship this shipment with all the packages on it, you would add that to the footer because again, you can't have it on the detail line because it's not going to know all the packages that are on the shipment yet, right? So you want to remember with header, detail, and footer, it's a clear hierarchy of information. You want all of that information added in the correct order, and then you're going to perform your transactions in that order. So header, first piece of information that needs processed. Detail, what's the next step? Footer, okay, what relies on everything else to happen before it can happen, like printing a BOL, that would go on your footer. Now, what types of transactions can I add here is probably what you're wondering at this point. There's a variety of them. So first, I could add a SQL script. Again, all of these things that I'm adding, are components that reside in Agility Design Studio. So in Design Studio, I could write a SQL script that's just saved in Design Studio. Maybe it is going back to that UDF example I used. Maybe it's a simple SQL script that's just updating UDF1 in the WiSys package table to be whatever I saved in that form field for palette style or palette type, right? So I typed in there, okay, it's a plastic palette. Okay, this script would grab whatever in that form field, and it'll add it to our package table, right? So it'll go to the palette that I just created, and it'll add that UDF to it. Transactions, this is the big one. This gives you access to all of the transactions that we have in Agility available for you, right? So everything you can do on the handheld, you can do here in Design Studio, the same thing, right? So if I want to preload a AR return, I can do that right here. If I want to go and if I want to do just a bin validation, I can do that, right? If I want to pick something, I can pick something. I can delete a line for a transfer request, so on and so forth. There are a ton of transactions that you can add in here. And then, of course, you just need to make sure you understand what level you want to add them on: footer, detail, header, right? Like we talked about before. But they're also relatively easy to set up. So if I go back to that shipment create, you'll see here kind of the same thing you see on the handheld, right? I need to tell it what the information is. So maybe pro number and trailer number, maybe those are form fields that I'm going to want to have, right? And maybe I'm going to want to user enter those and allow, when I click that button and I'm creating a shipment, I want the user to go ahead and put in the information for, what pro number, what trailer number, what rollout number do I have? The user enters that in, that's captured, and then it's passed to the transaction. The user here, I would just go ahead and I would go ahead and grab the actual user that I have. So what would that be? That would be default, and I could just go ahead and put current user there, and it'll grab the user that's using the system. Return new shipment number, that's going to be a return value. It's just going to be a number, and it's going to go ahead and generate the next sequential shipment number. So if my last shipment was 54, all right, now I got 55. Error message, return value, return error message, and that'll give me an error message from the system based off of what the actual error code is. I would fill out all that information. I could set up any object properties that are necessary, but just like that, same type of deal as on the handheld, you're good to go, right? I took this transaction, I tell it how to get the information it needs, and now I can go ahead and proceed. Now, let's say for whatever reason, I wanted the pro number to be something that's on my grid. I could go to view and I could actually grab a column from the grid, right? So what if for whatever reason I want my pro number just to be the package ID? I could go grab that, right? I could grab anything from the view. I could default something by just typing in something. Okay, I'm going to have my pro number be whatever the user enters, or I could have it just be today's date, right? Doesn't matter. I can set it up to be defaulted. I could have it user entered at the time that the user goes in with a form field, so on and so forth. So in addition to those transactions, you have the ability to add stored procedures. If any of this is something that some of our partners do frequently, if you need to make a stored procedure that, let's say, it loops through some things in SQL, if you need to do something like that, you can go ahead and create a stored procedure once again in Design Studio, and you can take that stored procedure using, HANA or SQL, whatever you're running, and you can stick it in here in Design Studio, add that functionality, and it's really the same as how a transaction works. So here I have one to get a line number from a scan, and I could just go in here and once again set up the same things, right? I'd need to grab doc entry from my view in most cases. So I go to view and find the doc entry number, user ID. You saw how you do that before. You would just default it to be the current user. Item code I would grab from my view, line number I would grab from my view, get all that information inputted, and we'd be good to go. Or actually, I wouldn't grab line number. I would just grab item code because line number is my output. But you get the sense there, right? Fill out all the parameters so it has the information it needs, and your stored procedure can perform. So if you need to write a stored procedure that loops through some information, doesn't matter if it's HANA or SQL, you write that in a component in Design Studio, you can attach it here. Then I also have the ability to disable these. I've been deleting them when I'm done with them, but I could also just disable them if I don't want to use them, and you have the work that you did in there in case you want to go back and turn that on later or make a copy of it, something like that. I'm going to keep removing them so our screen's not too crowded up with info. And then I can add crystal reports, nice labels, doc type prints. Again, these would be added, not doc type prints, but nice labels and crystal reports would be added as components. So I would, maybe I make a crystal report. I would go ahead and add that crystal report I have saved. I would go ahead and add that in Design Studio in my project. Then I could access that crystal report here and fill out the necessary information to have that crystal report print whenever this button is clicked. Doc type print, that works a little bit differently. That accesses the WiSys document manager. So I could say, okay, at this point, I want to print, I'm doing multiple palettes, so I want to print multiple palette labels. So I'll talk to document manager. It'll say, okay, document manager needs this palette batch ID for the batch that all those palettes belong to, so it can print all the different palette labels. And maybe that's user entered. Maybe I use a form field to assign a batch ID to all the palettes I selected, call it 1, 2, 3, 4. It grabs that from the user enter value, and then it will print the variety of batch labels, right? So I can easily set up a print there. And you see there's all kinds. It just accesses anything that is in our document manager. And the last piece that I want to talk about here is an if then else conditional. Really the big thing here to understand about this is it allows you to put in a conditional if statement for your transactions, right? So if we go back to that shipment idea, let's say I only want to create a new shipment if my shipment number is 0. So I could go in here and I could have my if condition name be shipment. All right, and then we're going to look at the view and we're going to go to shipment number. I can find that. There it is, shipment number. And then I'm just going to say if shipment number equals 0, then I'm going to have my transaction happen. So if shipment number is 0, then I'm going to add that transaction to go ahead and create a new shipment. And I would just fill out that transaction like normal here, right? So this allows me to add a conditional. Of course, you can have an else and an end statement. Now, anybody is familiar with other coding languages, you don't need to have like a if shipment number is greater than 0, you do this. If it's not, just nothing happens, right? I could put an end here that if shipment number is greater than 0, then nothing happens, or it maybe it prints a BOL or something like that, right? But you really just need to fill out the if you're using the conditional. That's the big purpose for it, right? Is to add that conditional. Okay, if I have a shipment number that equals 0, then I need to make a shipment, right? So we have the ability to do that and add some conditional information to our transactions as well. All right, so those are all the different transaction types. Some key information there. And one last piece I wanted to mention, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up because I know it took about the full hour, and I'm trying to squeeze in as much information as I can for you guys, but I'm sure there's going to be more questions after this, so feel free to reach out and we'll go over it some more in detail. But one other piece, going back to those components we talked about earlier, I actually still have the ability to have, a transaction that has a component attached to it. So here I'm on my print button that we had from our past session. I could actually print the label, and then I could have that component pop up for package line. So I think it's interesting just to see what that looks like too. So you can kind of make a hybrid button here, right? You can make a button that has a transaction on it, but then it also, um, it goes ahead and calls a component after the transaction function. So here I can click that line. I want my print button, so I could hit print my label to the screen. So there's my form field that I entered. Just give it 1. So here's my label. Can close that. I don't want to print my other label. Oh, well, I didn't define the whole entire definition there because I needed to link it to a column like I did earlier. Just kind of rushing to show things here, but you get the gist of that though. I can attach a grid to that button here. So what I should have did is I should have went in here to link columns, linked it up on package ID because it requires that. Save that. Package ID, yep. And then I could go in there and click the button and of course open that component after the button functions. But for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and skip that there. So I just want to run back over high level everything we covered because it was a lot today. So we reviewed that functionality we discussed last time. Again, that was just the real simple stuff, printing and the hyperlink availability, the ability to click that hyperlink and open up a document in SAP. After we reviewed that, then we got into the actual details. We talked about all the different buttons. So the ribbon bar that puts it at the top and allows you to, create a new tab and groups in that tab. Then we also had the toolbar button at the top, the link bar button at the bottom, and hyperlinks that allow you to create that blue hyperlinked field on any field in the grid. Then we talked about different button types, agility component, that just accesses a component that you already have made. So something like a grid or a graph or a calendar, you can press the button, have it open up inside of there, right? So it's just a pop-up inside of your grid that opens another grid or component of any sort. Plugin, again, that's more for development. That's a user control. It's captured as a plugin. Typically, you're not going to need to do this. It would be our development team creating that for you. And then we went through all the different transaction report transactions, which of course there is a lot, but in the flow, we have that ability to capture information hard coded through form variables or user entered through form fields. We have a startup query that we can do to run a validation before we perform any transactions. And then you just need to make sure you remember with your transactions, if something needs to happen before other things happen, that's on your header. The things that happen in the middle, the meat of the transaction is your detail. So here we have like create a shipment, add items to the shipment. And then on your footer, what can happen at the end, what needs these things to precede it. So here you would have like print a BOL or ship that shipment we created. And then lastly, the available actions. We can do SQL scripts that update, a WiSys table, like updating a UDF in the package table. We can do all the agility transactions like transferring a package, creating a shipment, shipping a shipment, so on and so forth. Stored procedures that can loop through something in SQL or HANA. So you would make that script. You'd make a SQL event using SQL or HANA. You could add that stored procedure in here and loop through any transactions that are necessary. Document printing for crystal reports or WiSys labels. Then lastly, we have the ability to do that if then else conditional, which really the big value there is the ability to put an if statement on there, right? And say, okay, if our shipment number equals 0, we'll go ahead and do this transaction. So I know that was a lot today. I am very happy that we were able to cover all that in an hour though, because that is a lot. That is the ins and outs of the transactions you can perform in Design Studio. And again, I encourage you to go back and watch this and develop more questions and reach out to me with those questions, because this video right here gives you the ability to basically do anything you need to in Design Studio. You might not be able to get all the details just from this video, but it gets you set up in the right direction to perform any transaction you need to create. So if you have any questions, check it out, reach out and let me know. But yeah, Aaron, I know we're at time here, but if we have any questions, I can stay over for a minute or two. And
no, I think people have a lot to digest here. It was a great session, and hopefully it just allows them to think a little bit more on the potential uses of the Agility desktop application, and really kind of understand the capabilities, like where they can go, where the edges are to our software, and they can push the boundaries in developing their own stuff. So obviously you could have some one-on-one with your consultant or your business analyst, but Chase is a good resource with any general questions about the product. I can help you with any sales related questions, any kind of licensing. If you need those design tools, if you don't own them today, you can always add them. So yeah, great job, Chase.
Thanks, Aaron. And again, everybody, if you're a customer or prospect, hopefully this gives you the tools to understand what you're capable of doing in there. If you're a partner, hopefully this answers some questions about how you can create something for one of your customers. But again, yeah, there's definitely still going to be gaps. We covered it at a high level. You got the tools to understand what's going on in Design Studio, but reach out to our team, use the resources you have available, and you'll be able to make some really great things or understand how to make some really great things.
Yeah.
So thanks
Well, I
for the
look forward
time.
to our next learning lab and see what you have for us next time, Chase. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.